The tide that turned, a tale of love, poverty, and perseverance. Under the sweltering sun of Mombasa, the ocean shimmered like a jewel. For tourists, the city was a paradise: Swahili culture, white sandy beaches, and the tantalizing aroma of freshly cooked samaki wa kupaka wafting from the beachfront stalls. But for Zawadi, Mombasa was a place of unending struggle. At just 19, Zawadi had already learned the weight of sacrifice. She was the eldest daughter in a family of 6, living in the cramped shantytown of Kisoni. Her mother spent her days selling fish at the market, while her father, once a proud fisherman, had been forced to retire after his aging boat was destroyed in a violent storm. The family barely survived on what little they could scrape together, and Zawadi's dreams of becoming a nurse had long been extinguished by the unrelenting grip of poverty. Every morning, Zawadi would help her mother at the market, her heart aching as she watched her younger siblings go to school in torn uniforms. She had once been like them, bright, ambitious, and full of hope. But hope didn't pay school fees. One evening, as the call to prayer echoed through the streets, Zawadi sat on the edge of a crumbling stone wall, gazing at the distant lights of the high-end hotels lining Nyali Beach. Beside her was Amina, the childhood friend who had left their neighborhood 2 years ago and returned unrecognizable. Amina wore designer clothes, carried the latest smartphone, and spoke of places Zawadi could only dream of. "Life doesn't have to be this hard, Zawadi," Amina said, her voice soft yet persuasive. "You're beautiful, and you have something people are willing to pay for. Think about your family. Think about what you could do with the money." Zawadi recoiled at the suggestion, but Amina's words lingered in her mind. That night, as she lay on the worn mat in her family's single-room home, she thought about her mother's tired eyes, her siblings' hungry faces, and the hopelessness that seemed to cling to her like a second skin. 2 weeks later, desperation outweighed her fear. Amina introduced her to the nightlife of Mombasa, a world of neon lights, pulsating music, and wealthy men looking for fleeting companionship. Zawadi's first night was a blur of shame and regret, but when Amina handed her an envelope of crisp notes, her guilt was momentarily drowned by the weight of responsibility lifted from her shoulders. She promised herself it would only be for a short while. The weeks turned into months, and Zawadi quickly adapted to her new life. She learned how to charm clients, negotiate prices, and mask her discomfort with a practiced smile. The money flowed in faster than she could have imagined. She moved her family out of their shanty and into a modest house in Bamburi. Her siblings returned to school with new uniforms and books, and her mother, unaware of the source of their newfound fortune, often thanked God for their blessings. Zawadi's transformation was undeniable. She bought expensive clothes, dined at upscale restaurants, and became a familiar face among the city's elite. Her name was whispered with envy by women in the neighborhood and admiration by men who frequented the city's hotspots. But beneath the glamour, Zawadi was haunted by an emptiness she couldn't escape. Every night, she scrubbed her skin raw in the shower, as if she could wash away the shame. She began to avoid her family, afraid they might somehow see the truth in her eyes. Then she met Omar. Omar was a soft-spoken man from Lamu, with a deep voice and kind eyes that seemed to see right through her. Unlike the men Zawadi had encountered in her line of work, Omar treated her with respect and genuine affection. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer any details. For the first time in years, Zawadi felt a glimmer of hope. Omar proposed, promising her a life far away from Mombasa and its suffocating secrets. She was ready to leave it all behind, but fate had other plans. A week before the engagement, Omar learned the truth about her past. She tried to explain, to tell him about the desperation that had driven her to that life, but his face was a mask of betrayal. "I thought I knew you," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "But I can't build a life with someone who's lived like this." Omar's departure shattered Zawadi's carefully constructed facade. She began to spiral, turning to alcohol to numb the pain. Her once thriving business crumbled as her reputation spread and her health began to deteriorate. She was diagnosed with a chronic illness, a consequence of years of unprotected encounters. By the time she reached her 30s, Zawadi was a shadow of her former self. The luxurious apartment was gone, replaced by a tiny room in a rundown part of the city. Her once envied beauty had faded, and the friends who had flocked to her during her heyday were nowhere to be found. One evening, she returned to her mother's home, carrying nothing but a small bag and a heart full of regret. Her mother welcomed her with open arms, but Zawadi could see the questions in her eyes. She never explained where she had been or what she had done. Sitting by the shore one afternoon, watching the waves crash against the rocks, Zawadi reflected on her life. The ocean, once a symbol of endless possibilities, now seemed a mirror of her own journey, rising high with promise, only to crash down in despair. But Zawadi refused to let her story end in tragedy. She joined a local church and began sharing her experiences with young girls in the community. Poverty is not an excuse to lose yourself, she often told them. Your worth is more than what someone is willing to pay for. She started a small tailoring business, teaching other women the craft to help them find an alternative to the streets. Though her scars, both physical and emotional, were a constant reminder of her past, she found solace in knowing she could prevent others from making the same mistakes. Zawadi's tale became a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. In the end, she learned that true perseverance was not about surviving poverty, but about reclaiming one's dignity and finding a purpose